And thank you, Uta, again for agreeing
Well,
to give the
thank
talk.
you so much, Christine. It is always a pleasure to be at the Interacting Mind Centre. We have so many lovely memories, so many friends, and now I have this presenting this talk, but it's truly a joint production because the talk is based on a chapter in a book that we've written, not the one that you've just seen, but one that is in production now and will be out next year. It's called What Makes Us Social, and one chapter is called Us and Them. And of course, the talk will be mostly a review of the literature, of all the things that we found really interesting, not necessarily comprehensive, and not really based very much on our own research. Now, social cognition, of course, is very often kind of dominated by talk about mentalizing, and we done a lot of work on this, and we ourselves believe very strongly that people with autism have problems in mentalizing to begin with. Everybody believed that autistic people would have problems in all aspects of social cognition. And the question was, is that actually true? Of course the answer is no, not at all. And I started to become interested in the phenomenon of in-groups and out-groups when Larry Hirschfeld visited the MRC unit I was working in, and he just asked whether autistic children recognize their own in-group. I had absolutely no idea, but he said, well, we can do a test. There is actually a test available which uses little line drawings, pictures, and we can test for the use of gender and race stereotypes even in preschool children. The test is called PRAM test. And so uses pictures like this, and it goes a bit like this. It says, this is Jack and this is Chloe. One of these children likes to play with dolls. Now the question to you, which child likes to play with dolls? Can you tell? I'm sure you can. That's, going with a gender stereotype. Now, here are two girls, identical line drawings, but different skin color, pinkish and brownish. That's all the difference you ever get, no more than that. So one question would be, here are two girls. One of them is a friendly girl. She has lots of friends. Which one is the friendly girl? Now, answer that. Now here comes a rather nasty one, which says, here are two girls. The girls found a lost wallet and returned it to its owner. Which girl returned the wallet? Now you can see how you can really probe for all sorts of stereotypes, even in very small children. And the results were absolutely astonishing to us, because there was equal use of stereotypes in the autistic children and in two comparisons groups of very young children, as you can see, and also of 6-year-olds. It was 70% roughly of the trials that we used, either for gender or for race, that showed there was a particular stereotype. Of course, if there was no stereotype, you should have got 50-50. There's no other reason to choose one girl over the other one, boy over the other one, girl over a boy. So, the case of autism is interesting because for us, mentalizing stood out as a capacity that was dysfunctional and would account for particular difficulties in reciprocal communication. But we were forced to say other social mechanisms might well be intact. And let's take a wider picture. We have to say that the human social brain, of course, overlaps with the brain of other mammals. And these brains share unconscious mechanisms that may act as startup kits for social learning. One of these mechanisms is affiliation. That's the term we like to use. We think it might be even more important than mentalizing because it's even more ancient in the evolutionary tree. Could it be that affiliation can act as an innate startup kit that drives us to form in-groups? Affiliation, of course, is seen most strongly and studied intensely in animals. And it's very evident not just in nurturing and bonding, but also is evident in spontaneous empathy. Now, it's generally thought that affiliation depends on familiarity and frequency of interactions with others, and of course young pups and young children are rightly afraid of strangers. You never know what they might do. And of course our family might be our first in-group. But we can ask the question, is affiliation responsible for the presence of in-groups that are not just based on similarity, familiarity? So it's not just our family. And here I'm immediately referring to the work of Sophie Scott and her colleagues. And they found out that people are 30 times more likely to laugh if they are together with another person. So it's not that they're laughing at the funniness of a particular joke. And they're laughing even more when they are with a crowd of similar people. So it seems that laughter is mostly about fitting in socially, certainly not much about how funny a joke actually is. Sophie Scott and colleagues conducted an experiment with Dutch and Japanese participants who listened to little decontextualized clips of laughter, and they judged whether the laughing person was from their cultural in-group or an out-group, and whether they thought the laughter was produced spontaneously or deliberately. And it turns out that you can use the distinction, you can tell whether laughter is spontaneous or made up. And you can also use this to infer the person's cultural group identity. So interestingly, this was a study done in the scanner. They found that when laughter was perceived as fake, then the mentalizing system was activated. That's the situation when suddenly you say, what's going on? Why is that person laughing deliberately? Now, if children are born with a mechanism for affiliation, how do they learn about their in-group? So the child's first in-group must be extended beyond the family. Of course, others live close by, speak the same dialect, sing the same songs. And a very interesting experiment showed that 9 to 12 months olds preferred the familiar songs. And they were, of course, using a number of indicators like the little time they spent listening to the songs, the presence of positive affect, rhythmic movements, autonomic relaxation. So robust findings, robust generalization across different singers, and demonstrating that it's songs that are strong signs of group membership and identity beyond the family. So it's not just that we have to explain the presence of in-group existing at all, but we have to explain why there is in-group favoritism, because it turns out that even 12 months olds or slightly younger infants already expect that they get help from their in-group members, and this is also found in studies where children observe situations where in-group members help each other or not. So one thing we have to can't ignore is that first impressions of other people are very hard to suppress, and faces are a good place to start. So we are all attracted to looking at faces from birth. And we build up a store of representations of familiar faces. We can spot a familiar face very easily. And the appearance of a face can be used as a compelling marker in what in folk psychology is thought of as race. So we have no difficulty distinguishing, for example, a Japanese face from a European face. But as we all know, race is a very slippery category, doesn't actually have clear boundaries. So how do we come to draw boundaries so readily? And what does this say for our feelings of identity? Now, this was explored in an experiment where faces were morphed along a continuum from typical European to typical Japanese. And observers were asked to categorize the faces, like those in this figure, as either European or Japanese. And the cutoff depended on who was doing the categorizing. So Japanese observers put the cutoff closer to the typical Japanese face, and the Europeans put it closer to the typical European face. So a recognition of race from faces is clearly dependent on the exposure to those faces. And this was shown by choosing Japanese observers who had lived in North America for at least a year. And these participants were much more similar to Europeans in their categorization. Now, similar effects have been observed for mixed race and black and white faces, as you can imagine, so that when there is somebody is mixed race, you might identify them according to your own preference into either of these categories. Now, here's another quite clever experiment where eye gaze following, again in this time in young infants, was used as an indicator, in this case, for perceiving and sharing the goal of another person. So Chinese infants, aged 7 months, took part in this study, where an adult model who was either Chinese or African was shown in the middle and then gazed towards one of these 4 positions on the screen. And once they've done that, a nice animal was revealed for the child to look at. Now, when gaze predicted the animal with 100% reliability, the infants followed adults' gaze regardless of their ethnicity. If there was only a 25% chance, a real chance of reliability, where the person looked where the animal appeared, they followed neither. But this is the interesting point: with a 50% reliability, the infants showed a strong preference to follow the in-group member's gaze and not the gaze of the out-group member. Now, there are other experiments with adults, and the question here was asked, are we merely surprised at seeing a strange face, or is our ancient alarm system responding because we feel threatened by the stranger? Now, Elizabeth Phelps and colleagues explored this question in terms of this very notorious racial contrast in America between white and black faces. Showing these to white participants, found that the outgroup elicited activity in the amygdala, indicating an automatically occurring threat response, a fearful appraisal. The alarm system was responding, and the negative appraisal that was elicited by the outgroup face was very, very rapid, also correlated with a measure of implicit race prejudice. Now, here is an experiment that was carried out by Shi Han, who was actually an associate of the Interacting Minds group and visited at the time. He carried out a very daring experiment. You can possibly just see that sometimes, I mean, first of all, the people were shown on the screen who were either European or Chinese, and the participants were either European or Chinese, and it was all crossed over. What was shown was, in one case, a nice cotton bud touched the cheek, and you see that, which was obviously not a painful stimulus to watch. And in another case, it was a needle that was pushed into the cheek, which clearly is very painful. And we do know that there is an automatic empathy response when we see other people in pain. Also, our own pain system reacts. That is a finding from other work. But here, the amazing finding was that this empathy response, which is so automatic, happens to be switched on only for your own in-group and not for your outgroup. And this was equally the case for the Chinese observers and the European observers. Now, this was shown in terms of brain activity, and made really people really feel quite interested, to say the least, in what was actually going on. And could this be reversed? Could it act? I mean, is this an involuntary response that you can turn on and off? And does it, is there no way of getting empathy for people from an outgroup, from a different race in this kind, a different ethnicity in this case? And yes, the empathic response could be reinstated. And this was after an outgroup member had become familiar to the ingroup members by, for example, putting them into the same team in a ping pong game. And this established familiarity, and immediately the empathic response would be shown to that member. So that's a bit of good news that can be done. Now, who actually is a group member? Well, the people who are similar, look similar, are grouped together, but as Lynn Bian and René Baillargeon showed with small children, this is actually context dependent. It isn't that they just really look at people who are similar and put them into one group or in another. They have really quite an abstract concept of a group. So they expect individuals in a group to be similar, but the similarity is not fixed in particular attributes. So they expected an in-group preference between two individuals who wore the same novel dress or outfit, but they dismissed the similarity if one of these outfits was actually used just to demonstrate an instrumental purpose. So if it was shown that person put on an apron, another person put on an apron to do some housework, that wasn't enough to establish a similarity of an in-group. They could absolutely distinguish between that similarity for an instrumental purpose and the similarity which is more like a mark of real group membership. Now, obviously we need to go behind the face and the first impressions, and there really are much deeper explanations to be found. Infants are born into not just the family, but into networks of individuals who are socially connected, and the question is, how do they begin to learn about which individuals are their potential in-group members, their potential social partners? Now, in these experiments by Thomas Sachs and Spelke, quite recent experiments, about 5 pretty intensive studies, they showed that when a parent showed signs of affiliation with a puppet, then the infants expected that the puppet would also engage with them. And the reverse. When the puppet engaged with the infants, then they expected the puppet also to respond to their parents. So the conclusion is that infants are very sensitive to emotional social interactions of new people with their own in-group. Now, emotions, of course, are incredibly important about in-group members and out-group members. It's not all only laughter and empathy, but there are many other emotions that you can feel about in-group members and out-group members. Now, this was an experiment which, as it's so new, it's not even published. You can find it in archive preprints, but I thought it was interesting enough to put into this talk. So here again, infants 10 to 11 months were shown to expect others to be happy when their friend succeeded in jumping over a wall, but not their enemy. So friends were defined when they moved together in a very friendly manner, and enemies were those who bumped into one another aggressively when they moved in opposite directions. So this is a very early appearing and for us very sort of natural seeming emotional response about friends and enemies. Now, children from preschool age show loyalty to their in-group and contempt for their out-group. This is a very strange thing. It's not just making a difference, but actually being, showing disdain for the out-group. There is a large body of work by Harriet Over and colleagues, which you can see and find in when you Google the name Over. And I'm just showing one experiment, McLaughlin and Ober, where they investigated actually the use of mental state attributions to members of an in-group versus an out-group. And these groups were none other than our animated triangles. So they actually told the children that the triangles were from kids from their own town, from their own school. Or from another school. And also they used gender. If it was a girl that they tested, they said, these are two girls. Or they said, these are two boys. Now, defining these as in-groups and out-groups. And the amazing thing, to me at least, was these children were 5 to 6 years old. And this was a very simple manipulation of what you consider to be an out-group or an in-group. And they spontaneously used mental state words more often in their description of the in-group triangles compared with descriptions they gave when the triangles were designated as out-groups. And the 6-year-olds produced a greater diversity of mental state terms when talking about triangles from their own social group. So, and nothing to do with appearance, how to define the groups. It was just what the experimenter assigned to really some very abstract shapes. Now, an excellent review of the literature exists by Dunham, which you can look at, and it concludes that the outgroup can be easily recognized simply by being different from us. And here's the thing. Whenever there's an in-group, there's also an out-group. So the in-group is actually defined by the out-group. And these are people who are different in whatever, appearance, language, song, behavioral norms, customs, and sometimes they are not different at all, but believed to be different. And sometimes, indeed, the differences are laughably small. Here is one, just something to make you perhaps laugh, giving an arbitrary norm, perhaps not quite so arbitrary, and you can see that dog obviously knows he shouldn't really do this using his tongue, but using knife and fork, like all the others, if he wants to belong to the civilized society. Now, very important is the, which you probably all know about, the so-called minimal groups, which are arbitrarily assigned. So just wearing different colored t-shirts suffices to create an in-group bias and ramp up the competition between two groups of children who are completely arbitrarily divided in these two. Now, this is very interesting because it really goes beyond the idea that it's all about race and about gender and about certain essentialist categories. These are completely arbitrary groups. And the most famous experiments perhaps were those done by Sherif and Sherif with boys' summer camps in the 1940s and 50s, probably starting already in the 1930s. So what happened was that they invited boys aged 12 to come to be in a summer camp for a couple of weeks, and they arbitrarily divided them. Actually, it is important to know that these boys came from pretty homogeneous neighborhoods. They weren't very, very different. That's one thing to remember. But they were given an identity of a name and a place where they could live in these woods. And one particularly famous story is about the group called the Eagles and the Rattlers, and they had absolutely epic fights, and they attacked each other, and they did all sorts of things to show how one group was better than the other, and it seemed pretty difficult to restore a feeling of cooperation between all of them afterwards, but it was possible. Now, when the groups were brought together again to re-establish peace at the end of their experience, it was, they were still trying to compete. So just eating together wasn't enough. Watching a movie together wasn't enough to bury these aggressive feelings. But they did get results when they introduced goals that both groups really cared about and which they had to work together to achieve. So, for example, the camp's water supply was secretly cut off. And in this case, both the eagles and the rattlers worked together to fix the problem. I have to also say that recently there's been quite some criticism of these famous experiments, suggesting that in fact there was probably more manipulation that they've admitted to make the groups competitive. Because there was such very fierce group animosity. But on the other hand, we are reminded of Harry Potter, which also lives on this idea that you have different in-groups and different out-groups. Everybody seems to immediately enter into this world. So, feelings are particularly strong when it's about political, ethnic, religious affiliations. And everyone knows the intense feelings that are created by international sports events. And we do feel the joy on behalf of our own team when they win and real misery when they lose. And I think this speaks very strongly to our self-identity as bound up with group affiliation. So self-identity very much hinges on where we belong, who we affiliate with. Now, Chris found an anecdote which I couldn't really verify, but it is just very funny. You all know the film Planet of the Apes, which actually deals very much with this idea of racial in-groups and out-groups in 1960s America. Anyway, during the filming, the cast, the people who were dressed up as chimpanzees or orangutans, or not at all, they were found during lunch breaks to separate out. So the chimpanzees sat with the chimpanzees, the orangutans sat with the orangutans, and so on. A very believable anecdote. Now, have some interim conclusions now. The distinction between in-groups and out-groups is something that has to do with our feelings of identity, our relationship with others. And I still believe that a powerful reason is our deeply seated need for affiliation. And of course it must be of great benefit to individuals because, we reap numerous advantages for being a member of our in-group. And this need is very well catered for by social media. And they've made it much easier than ever before to form groups based on specialized interests, on hobbies, on health concerns, on grievances, and so on. Now, here is an example of what happens during the development in the early school years. A study by Ernst Fehr. He simply asked the question whether children of different ages would share resources more as they got older. Yes, they did. They do share more. But when you look at this graph, it only applies to their in-group and not to their out-group. That, in this case, was children from another school. So sharing with the out-group actually went down with age. So you can see this is the amount percentage shared, and you can see how this goes up to the in-group and down in the out-group for the older children who were 7 to 8 years old, youngest were 3 to 4. Now, are there in-groups and out-groups in other animals. And yes, I think there are, because we all heard of the war of the ants. It's known to us that ant hives can really aggressively compete with each other. There are tribal warfares between chimpanzees, we know about it, but it seems to me really noticeable that not very detailed studies have actually been done on animals. And what on earth is the reason for groups to split up for the same species? It may be something simple as large numbers. It may be that there need to be some catalysts, don't know very much about, like hierarchical status or age, even separating out group members, sex, of course. But there is one study which I came across, very recent study, which was about rats. And I would love to see more such studies done, perhaps also with other animals. So in this experiment, there were very small numbers because they were very, very labor intensive. They really looked at the brain activities and the neurochemistry in the brains of these rats. But essentially what Bartal and colleagues did was that they used these normal white lab rats and put them together with a caged, trapped animal, which was either from their own strain or from a different strain, a black hooded rat. And they just wanted to see whether these rats would learn to open the door for the trapped rat, whether they were from their own strain or from any other strain. Over 2 weeks of testing, it was difficult for them to learn to open this door. Now it turned out that 6 out of 8 rats showed this, what they called helping behaviour for another rat of their own strain, and 0 out of 8 rats showed helping behaviour for another rat of a different strain. So quite a strong results, but very small numbers. Now, of course, we have to think about the advantages of belonging to an in-group, like protection, security, division of labor, less effortful interaction, and particularly being able to learn from reliable, trustworthy others. Of course, the advantages translate into disadvantages for the outgroup, and remember, whenever you're told about advantages, bear in mind there are also disadvantages. We come to them later. But I want to say a little bit more about what in-group, out-group divisions actually mean for our ability to learn from others. We observe others, but we do not learn indiscriminately from us. We learn from people we trust, and we trust members of our in-group. And we prefer to get knowledge from members of our in-group. But how do we explain this preference? And as I've shown already, infants, even very young ones, consider the in-group members as a source of more reliable knowledge. So why do they think that knowledge is more reliable and better? One reason is that we most frequently interact with people from our in-group, and the more similar we are to those people, the easier these interactions will be, and the similar we are to the other people in our in-group, the more likely it is that we will be recognized as members and avoid being expelled. I'll come to that in a moment. So it's really important to learn, to imitate, to do what your in-group members do. Another reason for preferring to learn from members of our in-group is, of course, trust. We believe the in-group members are less likely to try to deceive us than out-group members. And if they are found to deceive us, then we take steps to punish them. Interestingly, we do not do this. We do not punish members of an out-group if they deceive. We expect them to deceive us. We expect them to behave badly. So, for example, 3-year-old children enforce conventional game norms for in-group members, but not for out-group members. They think, oh, they can't even keep to the rules. They sort of expect that they would want to break them. Now, over-imitation is a particular interesting part of learning from others. As you all know, it means that we are not just copying in order to learn how to open a box, in this case, most efficiently, not at all. We want to learn how to do it the proper way. In other words, conform to the rules and conventions of the in-group. And this will be appropriately demonstrated even by group members whom we don't particularly like. So over-imitation is a potential generator of culture, because it's all about learning not how to do things, but how we do things. And already by age 5, children will consciously distance themselves from the behaviour of outgroup members. So in one study, having seen 3 outgroup members perform the same action with a novel toy rather than imitating them as they would with members of their own group, these children did something different with the toy. And in a study of delayed gratification, 3 to 5-year-old children practiced delaying more and valued it more when in-group delayers delayed and the out-group did not. And this was sort of behavior was accompanied by remarks as, I'm in the green group, the orange don't wait. So here is an interesting question. What is cause, what is effect? We trust members of our in-group, and that's why we learn from them, we imitate them, we laugh with them. Then, on the other hand, we imitate members of our in-group and we laugh together with them to increase affiliation. I'm wondering if there is a kind of circle going on that's actually acting all in the same direction. So we must talk about disadvantages of being in groups, as I already said. Living in groups, even in groups, means continuous tension between altruism, selfishness, cooperation, and competition. We need to talk a little bit about these major problems created by living in groups. So actually this comes from the comic book, just to put in an image to show you how we represent competition between groups. You have here one nice group where they are really totally cooperative, and here one nasty group where they are fighting against each other. So it turns out that in fact these groups will outcompete those groups in the end. Why, yes, can't we continually enlarge our in-group and always become, happier and more peaceful, become one big happy family? Well, there is a catch, because when individuals compete within a group, it is the uncooperative, the selfish individuals who do best, and when groups compete, it is the group with the more cooperative people who do best, so shown in the cartoon before. So if we all become one big group, it may not be a happy one. Selfish individuals can take over and our lives will become very unfair. So speculatively, this might be the cause of family feuds, which are notorious, in fact, for their ferocity. So if there are no competing outgroups, then the in-group may cease to be a nice place to be. So we do start talking about the dark side of our social brain. And what are all these nasty things? So that, it's very stupid that we are not learning from outgroup members. They may know things that the in-group members don't know, but we don't want to learn from them. We are not engaging empathy for outgroup members, as we've seen in that experiment, not spontaneously, and we may do it, which is a stupid thing. We despise outgroups, which is another incredibly stupid thing. And we ramp up competition between groups, happily, making things even worse. Now we come to an even more dark thing that we do. We threaten exclusion and we fear exclusion from membership, often referred to in literature as ostracism. So here is an example of, two enemies with James Bond and in a poker play, and this is absolutely and symbolizes that you wouldn't betray anything. You would definitely not imitate the other player, and you don't trust each other by not imitating each other. And here is the example of the really the way that we are so afraid of being expelled from our ingroup, which I think is shown in this picture, which is we recognize it's so true. It happens to all of us. It is a very very sad thing when we feel excluded. Generally, when members who deviate from the norms of the group should expect punishment from the group they belong to. They might be marked as traitors, they're thrown out into the cold, and sometimes we haven't done anything wrong but are still being excluded. So it's a twin feeling to the desire to being affiliated. Now, after experiencing ostracism, and this can be done in various manipulations with games, for example, where you definitely exclude one player. So participants were given the opportunity to interact with a likable member from their own in-group. And this individual was instructed to move their feet throughout their interaction. The previously ostracized participants tended to unconsciously copy these movements far more so than participants who had not been ostracized. And this has been shown in other experiments too. Ostracism generates feelings of depression, and it's particularly in evidence during adolescence when peer groups are becoming incredibly important. And we do see increased imitation of in-group members. It seems to offer a way to recover from these hurtful effects of exclusion to gain readmission. Even in toddlers, you can observe this effect. They show enhanced facial imitation if they feel excluded. And it occurs even if the exclusion is not personally experienced, but observed on a video. And even if the protagonists are just animated shapes. Another experiment shown by Over and Carpenter. Now, this finding has been extended with other age groups, but I've shown you only the one with the adults. Now, here's an interesting question. We talked about mentalizing and problems in mentalizing. We switched our interest to affiliation. We should also talk about problems in affiliation. If it is a separable mechanism, it might be that there are individual differences. There could be people who have real problems with affiliation, and psychopaths are contenders for having such problems. Well, we know they don't show empathy. That's how they are actually defined. They also should not show other contagious emotions such as laughter. That's an interesting novel prediction. You know they don't show empathy already, that's how to define them, but would you expect them not to be laughing in a group that is already laughing, this contagious laughter? And in fact this has been tested by Sophie Scott's group and by S.E. Wieding, and indeed it has been confirmed. Now, another question some of you might ask is autism too associated with lack of enduring affiliative bonds? I don't think so, but of course it has not been very rigorously tested. You could also use contagious laughter as a testing ground, and you might predict there is less of it. But remember, when I started, I told you the surprising facility that autistic children have in using stereotypes for in-groups and out-groups. So it seems to me that affiliation problems would not be expected in autism. So can we escape from the dark side. One obvious strategy to overcome our tendency to disparage the outgroup, I mean, we might not be able to do anything about the presence of in-groups and out-groups, but at least we should be able to do something about this tendency to disdain the out-group. And one way would be to deliberately think about their mental states. And I think we do need to avoid a consistently negative interpretation. Getting to know the outgroup would be the important thing, and this could be a result of deliberately making them members of our own team. Now, in-group bias has been reduced in the minimal group experiments. You remember the ones that are completely arbitrarily defined, in-groups and out-groups. And in the study by Misch, Paulus and Yarrow, they found that it is possible to reduce in-group bias by changing the expectation of collaboration between the groups. And they found this children and adults. They found it in the US and in Germany. So expectation of future collaboration is what's marked by having, same color t-shirts. But if you deliberately say, well, later on you will collaborate with the blue t-shirts, even if you have a yellow one, you already reduce this bias. Now we can reduce bias by perceiving ourselves as looking more like the outgroup. And this is very nicely shown in the rubber hand illusion, which I'm sure you know about. Now, a study by Meister and colleagues used the phenomenon of the rubber hand to study effects of self-perception on race prejudice. A hand of a light-skinned participant was paired and synchronized with a dark-skinned rubber hand. They now perceive the dark-skinned hand as their own. And remarkably, this experience reduced implicit bias as measured by the implicit association test, the IAT, which I'm sure you all know. And indeed, the stronger the experience of ownership of the dark-skinned hand, the greater the reduction in implicit racial bias. So it's an example of how strongly our people detectors are interested in similarity to ourselves. It also shows stereotypes can be overcome when we perceive ourselves as similar. So prejudice and stereotypes can change. Sometimes people say, I wonder how long the changes will last. But there's been one study, and this, I'm coming to the end of the talk, this has really looked at long-term trends between 2007 and 2020 by Charlesworth and Bernacchi, published recently in Psychological Science, and they have data from 3.4 million tests in the US, which is really very impressive. So they tested for explicit attitudes, which is asking for preference in questionnaires. What do they prefer, a man or a woman, an old or a young person, etc. And they also used, of course, data from the implicit association test to judge implicit attitudes. Now, the interesting finding is that the explicit prejudice decreased markedly over this time span, which is very good news, it seems to me, especially for race and also for sexual orientation. But there are a few categories where the attitudes didn't change so much. They still went down a little bit, 22%. Age, disability and body weight, these are still bad things that we're not very tolerant about. But yes, age, disability and body weight, we have to do a lot more work on, and of course we can still decrease our prejudices for race and gender and sexuality. Now, interestingly, we don't know, and the authors don't offer any explanation of why these changes actually came about, how this really worked. One way was to choose to do Granger causality models between the implicit attitude decrease and the explicit attitude decrease, and they just didn't really link to each other. So the explicit attitude change did not systematically perceive the implicit attitude change, nor the other way round. They didn't seem to relate to each other. I mean, almost, the conclusion must be they are sensitive to different sources of influence and societal transformations. So interesting areas to study and to investigate. Obviously there have been changes in the environment, in society. There have been also political incidents of certain movements, as you all know, and all these probably in the end contribute to these very long-term changes in our prejudices. So the question is, can we escape from the traps of this in-group, out-group distinction? So if we are completely free to decide who should we be working with, we do still have a natural inclination to choose people who are like us, people we are familiar with, people we feel we can trust. But really we should say, is this always a good idea? And the answer is not at all. This kind of tendency just leads to nepotism eventually, and corruption, and it really tempts us to be, showing this bias and favoritism of our in-groups, and creates problems in the long run. So science thrives on diversity. We really should not want to just surround ourselves by people who are very much like us. And this is what we think is exactly the case here at the IMC. A mixture of explorers and exploiters. That's especially important for progress in science. So explorers find new areas of research, they can find a way out of a dead end, they can come up with novel ideas, and exploiters make sure that a good idea is not abandoned prematurely. So we need this good mix of people in a group working together, not just explorers, exploited, also scientists, non-scientists, social people, loners, young and old, and so on. So we have to sort out any problems when working with diverse groups, and we need an overlap of many different qualities. So, for example, what you are studying here, and what we're interested in, what makes us social, we really need not just the psychologists and the brain imagers, but we need the linguists, the anthropologists, the sociologists, the political scientists, the people who study management, and so on. So to solve a difficult problem, that's the bottom line, always work with others who are different from you. And finally, let's see more studies on affiliation and problems of affiliation if they exist. We need to recognize both the good and bad aspects of our tendency to form in-groups and out-groups. And we believe the better we understand how in-groups and out-groups emerge, the more likely it is that we can mitigate the bad consequences. And this is when I finish. Thank you for your time.